When we think about who we are, one of the things that I am is teacher. And our introductory slides reminds us that last week when we looked at various perspectives that individuals come from when they evaluate an idea or a cultural action or a person's viewpoint. When I say that I'm a teacher, the same image does not rise in each of your minds. In fact, some very different images can come up. Last week we saw that there were things about God. There we go. Sorry, slide doesn't seem to be working right. We saw there were things so that we could learn about God, that we could see about God, that will help to take each of our thoughts captive, that we will help to learn to make what we think about obedient to Christ. Firstly, we saw that there's a distinction between the Creator and the creature, that as the Creator, He is infinite, He is eternal, He is unchangeable. We are the creation, and we are none of those things. He is the originator, and we are the responder. Secondly, we saw that while God is above us, and His thoughts and plans cannot be thoroughly understood by us, that He has chosen to have a relationship with us, chosen to have a relationship with the people that He created. He has chosen to visit our planet. First of all, when He walked with Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and from time to time throughout the Old Testament when He dropped in, for example, on Abraham, and also when He came in the person of Jesus Christ and walked our planet with His disciples. He has chosen to communicate with us. He did not need to do that. He has given us His Word, the Bible, so that we can see His plan and understand what is happening around us. Most importantly, and we'll be talking more about this next week, while we can see His power and His might around us, we can also see that He's not happy with us. Things are not going well. There are problems. Things are not perfect, which will be our expectation of a world run by God. But it is only through the Bible that we know why we're in that position and how He has set us up so that we can be reconciled to Him. Today we want to look at how our society views people and see what God has to say about that. People today are very confused about who they are and about how they fit into the world. As we see youngsters coming through school, more and more they are sure that the entire universe revolves around them. And their whole world comes crashing about them when they found out that on the whole, very few people really care about meeting their every whim immediately. Or as George Bernard Shaw puts it, the alternative to being used up by a mighty purpose is that we become a feverish, selfish little clot of ailments and grievances, complaining that the world will not devote itself to making you happy. From my reading of Facebook, I think that there are many people who are in that camp. The media doesn't do us much of a favor. It keeps pumping us up, keeps giving us an unrealistic expectation of life. You deserve a break today. Eat McDonald's. Have a break. Have a Kit Kat. You deserve a holiday because it isn't really a holiday unless you get away. So let's go to the cabin by the seaside and have a holiday. You deserve a U-Butte camper van. The man that you are with at the minute, does he devote all of his time and energy to you? Or does he spend time at work? He doesn't deserve you if he does that. He isn't good enough. You deserve a man who's crazy about you. You deserve to be with someone who doesn't complicate your life. I think that's an interesting viewpoint on things. You deserve this bar of chocolate. We get so full of the idea of the things that we deserve that we have set up a society where newlyweds absolutely refuse to have grandma's old fridge in their kitchen, because they deserve better than that. I remember once having an interview at school with a father whose son had just stacked his second-hand car, and his father said to me it was all his fault because he should have known better than to buy him a second-hand car. He should have bought him a brand new one. And I was just flabbergasted by the idea that that was the expectation. In our rush to consume, we forget that most of our planet doesn't live like this. Most of them cannot afford McDonald's, have never seen a chocolate bar, have never had a holiday, don't have electricity, and a good number of them are happier than we are. How can that possibly be? On the other side of it, we have many philosophers in our age today who say that we are only animals, that there are no morals anywhere except that what we as a society have set up and have invented in order to keep people in check. So we have people saying, Mark Twain, I have been studying the traits and the dispositions of the lower animals, so-called, and in contrasting them with the traits and dispositions of man, I find the result humiliating to me, because the animals are better, is the... We are animals. We're born like every other mammal, and we live our whole lives around disguised animal thoughts. So we keep our animality in check, or at least disguised. Animals are not human with reduced capacities. They have their own capacities, their own spectrum of aptitudes and behaviors. In a book that's bound to provoke controversy, faithful husbands and wives are likened to caged animals, and it is argued that they should be free to explore their wild side with lovers without the threat of divorce. No wonder so many people are confused. Am I of the same worth as a worm and yet still deserve to have chocolates and holidays? Do I deserve the world on a platter? How do we sort through this and decide who we are? I want us to take a look at Genesis 1 and 2. And I want us to watch as God creates the heavens and the earth. Last week we stepped back and we looked at what the world looked like before creation. Now we want to actually step into that creation day and have a look at this. Here is God who calls out for the light and the sky and the oceans and the stars. And they are. He says, let there be light, and there was light. Let there be an expanse, and there was one. Let the dry land appear, and we had land. Let the earth land produce vegetation. Let there be lights in the expanse. Let the waters teem with living creatures. Let the birds fly above the earth. Let the land produce living creatures according to their kind. And it was so, and God saw that it was good. This is how things came into being. Then when God decides that he is going to make a man, he gets down on his hands and knees and he forms a man out of the dust of the earth. And he breathes into him the breath of life. This is the picture that we're given in Genesis chapter 2. And so God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him, male and female he created them. We are the pinnacle of creation. We are a special creation of God. We didn't just evolve from the other animals. We were made for a purpose. We are made in the image of God. Now I want us to step back for a minute, and I want us to think about what image of God meant to Moses in the cultural situation in which he's writing. Moses comes out of Egypt, and already in Moses' time, the mythology of Egypt that we teach children in school as ancient history was well and truly developed. In Egypt, according to the myths at the time, Pharaoh was a god. He was the son of a god. And as such, he was the image of God. But he was the only one out of all the Egyptians who was an image of God. He had a Ba and a Ka. They're two spirits that joined together in him. When he died, his ka went to the afterlife, but his ba lived on in his body. Therefore, you had to be very careful how you took care of his body to make sure that his ba didn't die, to keep him going. So not only did they build some fantastic sarcophaguses in order to protect those sorts of things, but they also brought him offerings. Did you know that if they didn't feed the ba, then the ba would die? And so they brought offerings, not offerings to say thank you, but offerings to actually feed the god so that he would stay alive. If the body is destroyed, that ba can live on in an image of the pharaoh. And so we have a well-developed art of having images of the pharaohs where the ba can then live. And so if you walk past this at Abu Simbel, if the religion were correct, the image of Ramses that you have in front of you there, his ba can live on in him, in that image, and he can watch you and see what you're doing. The Egyptians therefore built a very complex and expensive economy around these ideas and spent a lot of time creating impregnable tombs, unshakable images, wonders of the ancient world already in place at Moses' time. And this is the culture out of which Moses says something very different. In God's world, this is not the way things happen. I just show you quickly, in our day today, we do something very similar when we put up pictures of the Queen in all of our public buildings. Why is the Queen there in all of our public buildings? It's not really quite as crass as she's watching you, but it is to remind us that whatever we do is under her watch and in her name or something like that, isn't it? And in some other places in the world, you have a similar sort of thing where huge images are put up to keep in mind those things. But let's go back to the Egyptian context and say, into this context, Moses tells us that the living and true God has made all people, not just Pharaoh, in his own image. When God visits the earth, when he walks with Adam in the garden, when he drops in on Abraham, when he walks with his disciple, he comes as a man in the image of God. We are not to make images of God against what they did in Egypt. We are not to make images of God. God has made his own image, and we are it. Okay, we are the image of God. Whenever we look at ourselves, we see the image of God. We understand what God is like in part because we have a physical body that can hold things, that can see things, and that can do things. We rise again from the dead, and we believe firmly in the resurrection because our physical body is tied to the idea of image of God in us. We are also moral beings. We understand good and rottenness, and we can tell the difference. We have intelligence, emotions, reason, and morality. All of these things about us are image of God. In fact, everything about us that isn't sinful is image of God. It is the image of God that is also our point of contact between us and any other person on the globe. We know God because we are like him, and we are not God, but nor are we becoming God. These are all things that we need to look at and see what the Bible has to say on this and keep it within our scope. What is our purpose? What does the Bible tell us that we were made to do? In Genesis 1:28, it says, God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air and over every living creature that moves on the ground. When I look at that verse, I see three purposes for man that are mentioned there. The first one is to have babies and fill the earth, which I think that we've probably done a pretty good job of at this point. There aren't too many places in the world that don't have people in it. To subdue the world, when you think of Adam and Eve standing in the Garden of Eden, not knowing what anything around them was good for, The idea of subduing the earth is to find out what all of these things are good for and how you can use them and develop them and change them and make them into something that will be useful. So when Ray was talking about developing culture and learning how to use metals and making musical instruments and developing all of those things, when Adam and Eve stand there and they're told they have to subdue the earth, that's part of what's in mind there. And the third thing they have to do is to rule the earth. Rule over the sea, the fish of the seas, and the birds of the air, and over every living creature that moves on the ground. This is part of what our job is as people, is to rule over the earth. Now, what does it mean to rule over the earth? It means that we're in charge of things, but it means that we need to do these things in God's name and as God's agents in the world. We need to look at all sorts of issues about the world. We need to look at things like the ecological situation in the world. We need to look at animals and the way that we treat them. But we need to keep them in their rightful place at the same time. And we need to see that God gave us this world in order to rule it. We need to rule it wisely on the one hand, but we don't want any one other thing to take over and to become the ruler. So that things like animal rights, which are on the rise at the minute, there are lots of things about animal rights that I would support, but we need to be careful that it doesn't become a dominating force. Wouldn't it be great if the end of the story was that God created everything and it was good, and this is the job that we have to do? God made us and we're the pinnacle of creation. We have dignity and purpose. We were made in His image. We have a fulfilling job to do, and we can do it under Him to His glory. We really are up there on the scale of being, and by God's own mouth, we are good. Well, sometimes we get a bit caught up in our world, but when things are needed, we come good again, don't we? Things like this story about mateship. When there's a big flood and people help each other and they get in there and they work things out and they help people that are in need. People give and donate lots of money to help people that are having issues. Really, aren't we basically good? No, because with every story that comes about people who have helped people in the flood, there also are the stories that come of the looting and the other things that go with that show that basically we are not good. It isn't the end of the story. It's only the very beginning. I want us to go back again to the garden and listen as the serpent comes to Eve and tempts her. Has God really said that you can't touch this thing? God is worried because if you do this, then you're going to be like Him. And look at her response. She stops and she evaluates the situation for herself. She claims independence by making her own judgment about the fruit. It looks good. It looks like it'd be good to eat. And there's a bonus. I will be wise. Here is the essence of sin and self-deception, an independence and autonomy that sets us and our judgment above God. This is the goal of much of our secular age, isn't it? To set us that. Notice too with this, the progress that happens here, I tell the kids at school, at the point, having the temptation is never a problem. It's what you do with the temptation that becomes the issue. Watch as she stops and lingers and considers. And already she's moving in the wrong direction, isn't she? When you are working with a computer, it happens from time to time that you put something into your search engine and up come these most inappropriate pictures in the entire world. Teachers learn very, very early in their career that the first thing you do is turn off the screen, because then you can't see the picture, then you deal with the issue. But when this happens at home to your kids in their own bedrooms, what do they do about this thing? Do they look at this and go, "Mom, look what happened. This is a terrible thing," or do they stop and go, "Oh, this is not what I expected, but oh, that's interesting, isn't it? And that's the lingering then that leads to us actually going into the temptation and making the decision that really it's not going to hurt anybody and it looks like fun. Since the fall, our position is even more complicated. Not only are we God's image and not God, but now the image that we are is distorted. It's a sinful image of God, living in a world that groans with the effects of sin. And that makes our whole job a lot harder, because now we have to look at this and say, what is distortion and what is real image? Those of us who know Jesus Christ as redeemed images of Christ, our job is to learn all over again, to think God's thoughts after Him, and to bring, as we talked about last week, bring every thought that we have captive to Christ. So what are we looking at here? Independence. Is independence a good thing or a bad thing? Well, obviously there are some aspects of independence that are good. We don't want children who never walk because they are not ever allowed to put their foot on the floor because they're so dependent on their parents. We want children to learn how to do things, and we want a certain amount of independence. But ultimately, if you're looking at independence as autonomy, it is a sin. And we have to learn to acknowledge our dependence on God for everything. Despite the patronizing neo-atheistic chatter about needing a crutch or needing to grow up, it isn't about you or about me, it's about Him. This is not just my opinion or my perspective, it's what God has told us in His Word. What else? We are not equal with other animals. Animals are under our control. We can manage them as we want under God. We're not to abuse them. We certainly are clear to eat them. Animals do not have personhood, and they do not go to heaven. These are things that come out of the flow of the thoughts that we've talked about today. How do we deal with the unbeliever then, and his knowledge and his insight? Having criticized the unbelieving worldview at some very basic levels, how can we trust anything that they say or do? Is any of it trustworthy? Do we have to start from scratch and check out everything that has ever been done? All of those mathematical theorems, all of that scientific evidence, all of those history books, those engineering masterpieces, the artwork, and the music? Can any of it be good? Is any of it salvable? Can we use it as believers? And even that is a new way of thinking, isn't it, for many of us? Because we're used to coming the other way and just assuming that everything is good, and we bow quickly to the expertise of whoever we decide is an expert on something. Fortunately, both for us and for them, the unbeliever is inconsistent in his approach to life. There's a musician who picks his score, who makes up his score by choosing notes by random. And he randomly puts notes down on the page, and that's his next piece of music. The same musician collects mushrooms, and he doesn't use the same method. He does not randomly go through the fields and pick up everything that looks like a mushroom and eat it. Fortunately for us, we can then eat at his table without worrying about dying or tripping out, but as in Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds tripping. Similarly, we'll find much in the world that we can rightly teach our children, because although it's discovered, developed, or talked about by unbelievers, they do have aspects of the truth in what they do and what they say. We know that God gives life and breath and rain and sunshine and bread and rice and jobs and marriages and sunsets and dreams to unbelievers as well as to the believer. The believer tastes of God's goodness and recognizes it as coming from Him. The unbeliever doesn't recognize it as such. They have been made in God's image, but they do not acknowledge it. And sometimes, even in that, they will hit on the truth about something, and sometimes the truth that they give us will be a little bit twisted, the way that the distorted images were that we looked at earlier. Man still thinks and reasons. He still perceives the world. Because of God's grace, we have a restraint on sin and depravity in the world, and we are able to think and act according to the remaining effects of us being God's image, even if there's some that do not acknowledge a creator. So then, if we live in the middle of this society that doesn't acknowledge Christ as being Lord, what do we do and how do we operate within it? I want to give you a couple of little principles as we close today. The first thing I want to say is, don't be naive. Everybody has an agenda. So when you look at whether it's advertising on TV or whether it's an article that you read in the newspaper, whether it's a children's book that you are reading, I want you to stop and to think about it and to analyze what this message is that you're giving and why, and be careful about what you're doing. Secondly, we can know truth truly, but not exhaustively. Man is not the arbiter of truth. Thirdly, I want you to watch for the distortion of sin in everything that we do and say, but at the same time, be sure to use the good things that you find in wherever you find them. And lastly, I want you to encourage you to go back to your Bibles, and I want you to work on that lifelong project that we talked about last week, capturing every thought that we have and examining it as to whether or not it lines up with God has to say, with what the Bible has to say that we are and that we should be doing. Thank you.